I have a couple of guests. I have incoming Cheyenne City Councilman Richard Johnson, and I also have Cheyenne attorney and University of Wyoming instructor Chris Koski. Good morning, gentlemen.
Hello. Good morning.
Now, what we're talking about this morning are racial housing covenants, and just to explain for our audience how this came about, a friend of mine is buying a home in an older part of Cheyenne off of, I believe it's Pershing Boulevard, and he was a little surprised when he got the paperwork on the home. It does include a racial covenant, which we understand dates from 1941. It basically says nobody who's not a Caucasian can live here, in so many words. It does have exceptions for domestic servants, but other than that, if you weren't a white person, you're not allowed to live there. Chris, as an attorney, are these kind of covenants pretty common in Cheyenne among older neighborhoods?
You know, Doug, unfortunately they are. These covenants date back to the early 1900s up to, in Cheyenne, approximately 1960. I guess first question you'd ask is, what is a covenant? And that's basically when the subdivision was formed. It was a contract that the subdividers or early homeowners kind of had entered into amongst one another that what we say runs with the land and binds future owners. So the way I look at a covenant is that it's this contract that the previous homeowners entered into that binds the current homeowners. And as I indicated, in Cheyenne, unfortunately, we see these very distasteful covenants, from a different generation.
Now, is this just a Cheyenne thing, or were these common across the country at one point? Our student group looked into this as far as the state of Wyoming, and we've identified other communities in Wyoming that have similar covenants. Typically, communities that that have some older neighborhoods. We are aware of some in Laramie, perhaps up in the Sheridan area. Across the country, I'm a little bit less familiar, but from the reading I've done, I do believe that there are plenty of places with these types of covenants. If I had to take an educated guess, I'd tend to guess that in the South we might run into them quite a bit more. Well, and one thing that struck me about this, and maybe I'm a little naive, but I like to think of Wyoming as the equality state. To my knowledge, we have no history in this state ever of legalized segregation of the type they had in, say, Mississippi. I was frankly a little shocked. I think most people today, when they see this, most 21st century Cheyenne residents would find this extremely distasteful.
Doug, I absolutely agree with you. Certainly I grew up and was raised in Wyoming. I've, never got a sense that, we're a racist state. I feel that Wyoming and specifically the Cheyenne community is a very welcoming community. I obviously wasn't around when some of these covenants in the early 1900s were entered into, and perhaps there was a different viewpoint there then. It is possible that a lot of these covenants came from firm covenants from other places and other states. You see a lot of that, especially in the earlier 1900s, where forms were much more common. So that is a possibility. The way I look at it is, regardless of what the viewpoint might have been, 100 years ago. I do think it's right that Cheyenne expressed what its current viewpoint is, and I think you hit the nail on the head. That I think the overwhelming majority of Cheyenne residents would find these covenants distasteful.
Why did anybody feel this was necessary in the first place?
Well, Doug, that's a real good question. That once again, I wasn't around to answer. I suspect that society operated quite a bit differently many years ago. Over the years, we've tried to right wrongs. I believe that most people would have the viewpoint in Wyoming that we don't judge people based on race, skin, or religion. That's not an appropriate way to judge a person. So I just don't know the answer why anyone thought it was necessary. But I can say, not only are they unenforceable today, I would say almost everyone would take the viewpoint that they are not currently necessary, and quite frankly are just dead wrong.
Well, let's talk about the enforceability, because it's clear that in the modern world you can enforce these. Give us a little quick thumbnail sketch on why this is not enforceable and when all that changed.
Yeah, and that's a great question. So we talked about the covenant as kind of being this contract that the earliest homeowners in the subdivision or the subdivider kind of entered into, that it's a set of rules that everyone agrees to be bound by. That's what a covenant is. Taking it back to that basic point, and the difference between a covenant and other types of homeowners. One point that we'll talk about a little bit later is, just like any other contracts, covenants can be amended. But you asked the question of, are these covenants enforceable? And the short answer is no. In 1948, the United States Supreme Court in Shelley v. Kramer held that racially restricted covenants violate the Equal Protection Clause, which is the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. In addition, federal law under the Fair Housing Act also limits the enforceability of these covenants. But here is the critical point. If you take a look at the 14th Amendment, it provides that no state shall make or enforce any law that would be based upon race. Well, that says that the Wyoming courts are going to be precluded from enforcing the covenant contract. And so, while we do have these provisions, a Wyoming court could not enforce the provision, thankfully. But one thing to keep in mind is the contractual provision still exists. What you theoretically have is a contractual provision amongst all of the various homeowners in the subdivision that, quite frankly, only white people can live there. So it's not enforceable. But what you do have is you have this kind of contractual provision that says this is what all the people in the subdivision agree to. And going back to your first statement of your boss that was looking to buy a home in Cheyenne, if you're out looking for a home in an area that has covenants, typically the real estate agent's going to have an obligation to provide you a copy of the covenant. And that's so you understand the rules that might dictate the occupancy and use of the home prior to buying it. Well, one of the, and I think that the big issue here is that while these covenants are not perhaps legally enforceable, if you're out looking for a home, you get that covenant that says only white people can live here. I think most people are going to be taken quite aback, and some people are going to feel very unwelcome. And certainly that's not, in my opinion, what we as a welcoming community in Cheyenne, Wyoming, would like to portray. So just getting back to the point, the law is going to say that the state cannot enforce the covenant. It doesn't say the covenant doesn't exist or is void. It just says it cannot be enforced. So it's kind of a legal distinction here where you have an unenforceable contractual provision that still exists, if that makes sense.
Now, Richard, I know when you were on the city council before, you took a look at this. Is that right?
Yeah, the way I found out about it was through the chicken ordinance, because I started looking at covenants in regards to livestock. Going back to kind of your first question, you have to look at history in its context, because like Chris brought up in regards to the 14th Amendment, that's one of the Civil War amendments. Mm-hmm. And then, forgive me if I'm wrong, Chris, on the case, but basically when Jim Crow came into, like between the 1870s and 1890s, a lot of the 14th Amendment's provisions were, when they went before the Supreme Court, that was when Jim Crow came into being. And so you still do see some of this in Cheyenne and across the country as it moved westward because of the Jim Crow laws. And even though it's not in a covenant, this is still disturbing when people move to Cheyenne and they're like, is there an area of town that I shouldn't move into? And so when you ask, necessarily like in Moorhaven Heights is where this covenant, you mainly can see it. There have been other areas of town where it's been redacted, but you have that stigma of people who try to stay away from selling homes on the south side, or, up until about 30 years ago on the west side. And so when you ask the question about whether or not that, was there segregation in Cheyenne, there absolutely was. I've talked to people that were born in the late 1940s, early 1950s that said that, it was an unwritten law that black people were not allowed east of Pioneer, that they were to stay in the west side. And then I've also wrote a story about what was called the Poso, which was down around Crow Creek, near the Eagle's Nest and everything right by MLK Park. And so there were areas of town where basically the city of Cheyenne expected people of color to live. And so, yes, segregation was alive and well. I believe it still is, even when people come into town and try to get detracted from buying property in certain areas of town. So I believe it still exists, even if there isn't a official covenant on the book.
Richard, if you have personal knowledge of this, or if you have any research on it, where is this still an issue in Cheyenne today? What parts of town?
Well, I think a lot of it still has to do with, like when people move into town, that they're asking, what areas are classified as safe. And so ever since I've even grown up here, the South Side has had that stigma that it's not a safe neighborhood, and I've never had a problem. I used to mow yards there in high school, and I never had any issues whatsoever. So as far as being safe, now the semantics are a little different, than what they were, say when a lot of these covenants were written between, 1870 to 1960. So I think that it's still prevalent. What I found when I read books, it was amazing because I was on the same mindset as you when you brought up, racism in our area, is when I read this book called Wounded Knee 2 that was about the 1973 Wounded Knee uprising under AIM. And it was amazing reading all these primary sources of newspapers throughout our area that people treated Native Americans with such derogatory slang, even in our own region.
So this isn't just aimed at African Americans necessarily.
No, because if you read the way the language is stated in the covenant, it says those of a non-Caucasian race.
Now, Richard, when you were on the city council, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe you tried to tackle this and you found it wasn't so easy to get rid of. Am I right?
Yeah, when I started looking into it, and that's how Chris and I really started talking, was because I posted about this, and so Chris and I started the conversation, and then he obviously took it way further because he was more educated than me on the topic. But yeah, I started looking into this, and I brought it up at an NAACP meeting and things, and because it wasn't enforceable, I thought, it's like, well, can we get rid of something local? Why do we have to focus so nationwide on other topics? I'm always like, you're supposed to act locally, think globally. So I was more of that mindset. So I did bring it up to the NAACP, but then I had talked with Chris, we've been on this topic for 4 years now since Chris and I first brought it up. But I can let, Chris kind of tackle that question because he's more educated on it.
Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess the question you're asking is, how do we address the racial covenants at this point? Is that the question?
Yes, I would say that is the question.
Okay. Yeah, and so, as Richard indicated, he had posted something on Facebook. We had talked back and forth. My background is I teach the landman program at the University of Wyoming, which is basically, undergraduate students that are typically going in to negotiate agreements in the energy industry. And a big part of that is covenant law, because we obviously have to worry about what's the restrictions on the use of land. And so when you look at the ability to amend it, a covenant, just like any other contract, is capable of being amended. Now, if the covenant is silent, means it doesn't say exactly how amendment occurs, typically you need unanimous consent of all the people bound to the covenant, which would be all the homeowners in a particular subdivision, to rescind or amend the covenant. And so that's typically what you're going to do, is look at the covenant first and say, how do we amend? If it's silent, you're probably going to want to get signatures of all the people that are currently bound to the covenant. However, many covenants, and including some that we looked at in Cheyenne, such as the Arner Second Division, they have provisions in the covenant itself that says these covenants can be amended by a certain amount of people's consent, and we're talking about consent of the homeowners. So the way that to actually address this issue, which our student group started a few years ago in a couple of subdivisions in Cheyenne, have run into some difficulties in finishing the project. But what you can do is you can draft a covenant amendment to basically say the racial covenant provision shall be stricken completely, and then you get enough signatures, and that will amend the covenant. You record that, and from a contractual perspective, the covenant no longer binds the parties. So it's a way, kind of from a contractual amendment standpoint, to say, hey, we no longer believe that all of us agree to be bound by this provision. We all agree that we find this provision distasteful. You contract around it. I'll give you a couple examples that some of the questions that when we started tackling this problem several years ago that we got. One of the biggest comments was, well, you all are trying to delete or erase history. And one thing I want to say is, if you amend a covenant, that is in no way deleting or erasing history. Amending a covenant would be a new document that's executed by the people saying, we are amending the prior document to get rid of that racial provision. And then you record it in the county clerk's office. So what an amendment would do is, if an amendment was done and was recorded in the county clerk's office, then when someone went to buy a home, they would be given the original covenant and the amendment. So they would say, hey, originally this neighborhood had this very distasteful provision, but now all these folks have agreed they don't agree to this provision. They say that their community is welcoming. And so so that's the process for amendment under the covenants themselves.
Chris, why can't and Richard too, as far as that goes, maybe I'm being simple-minded here, but why couldn't the Cheyenne City Council just pass an ordinance saying we strike all such covenants within our city boundaries? Apparently it doesn't work that way. Why not?
Chris, I'll let you handle that.
I'll start, and I'll let Richard fill in. From my perspective, and first I want to tell you, I do believe that there's some people in the legislature currently looking at some draft language to perhaps address this issue. I don't think the legislature on their own can address the issue. I think that it does require private agreement. And one issue is, how can a city council tell people what they can and can't agree to? That goes to the issue of freedom of contract.
Gotcha.
But what the city council can get to is whether a contractual provision is enforceable or not. Do I believe the city council needs to say that? Probably not, because we already have the Shelley v. Kramer and the Federal Fair Housing Act that do the same. The covenant amendment process is the people to the actual people that are subject to the contract are saying, hey, we don't agree with that provision. We want that changed. From my, and I'm not a legislation expert. I'll tell you that. But from my viewpoint, I'm not sure that there's really an ability or reason for the city council to address the fundamental issue.
It would pretty much be meaningless, is what you're saying, I think.
That would be my viewpoint. I'd love to hear Richard's view, and I know he had looked into this previously.
Richard?
Okay, so when it comes down to it, what we were looking at is like how I started looking at livestock covenants and then found this is basically it opens the door. And so that was another drawback that we had when we were kind of approaching removing the racial covenants, was the fact that a lot of people didn't want their neighborhood to know that they could actually make modifications to their contract or their covenant And so I think a lot of it was they were hoping to keep people dumb. Like what Chris said in regards to a city council, if you were to actually draft, which would be kind of ceremonial language, really didn't have like teeth, like pretty much, the covenants don't, is that it would open the door for, it's like, well, if you're going to, make a statement redacting the racial covenant, I went into my covenant and I didn't like this. Like, I didn't like, setbacks on fences, or I didn't like, that I couldn't have a barn, or that I couldn't have a horse. And there, it just would basically open that door that when you state you're focusing on one specific topic, but when you open that door, it starts educating people. And so, like Chris says, if the city council was to make a statement, that's pretty much what it would be, as a resolution, because an ordinance would be like city law, but it would kind of infringe like on other things. Now in the modern day, you'd have to look under homeowners association. So even though you're doing old covenants, how are you infringing on, other things? So there's always repercussions to when city council brings up these types of things.
Richard, do you think it would be worthwhile to do a resolution just to show that we don't think that way anymore?
I mean, like Chris said, at this point, statements, from the the NAACP. I know Compassion Cheyenne, supported me when I drafted my original letter to the original article to the Wyoming Tribune Eagle. So in this part, a resolution would just kind of, it'd be a little fruitless in the aspect, like what Chris said, is because that language has already been stated, in federal courts or, case law. It's been stated, in the 14th Amendment. It's also went through the Civil Rights Act of 1964-65. So a lot of that's already been stated, unless you actually had some new groundbreaking thing for us to, break, it would be a little difficult just to say we support, these, past 100 years of case law and things that happened, nearly 50 years ago.
This is a tough question and understandable if you don't have the answer to it, but I am curious. Do we know of these covenants ever actually being enforced in Cheyenne?
I guess it would be like the unwritten law, like I said, with Pioneer being the cutoff point that was unwritten. I never saw any ordinance or anything, but hopefully it would have been redacted, in the 70s, after the civil rights legislation would have taken place in the 60s. So I haven't went that far back, but I think it would have been more unwritten, like it was assumed that everybody knew that. And so that was how, if there was enforcement, it was probably like, one of those like jokes around the water cooler type things, but we're in a different time now than we were then. I'm not saying that racism doesn't exist now, but a lot of it, if it was enforced, it was probably assumed at that point when it was taking place between, the 1900s all the way up and through the late 1950s.
Okay, so just to summarize for people who may just be joining the program, we're talking about racial covenants in Cheyenne neighborhoods. They're still in writing. A friend of mine buying a home in a portion of Cheyenne showed me the paperwork the other day. I was a little shocked and quite surprised. We like to think of ourselves as the equality state, and certainly that does not live up to that image. But having said all of that, a lot of people would say, hey, it's not enforceable. Let's just leave it alone and tackle other issues. How would you guys respond to that?
You want to go first, Chris?
Yeah, I'll go first. I see it as an issue because, someone coming from out of Wyoming, they're not going to have that understanding. The first thing when they're looking for a home is they're given a piece of paper that might say you're not welcome here. Mm-hmm. I think that's a pretty big issue. And so, I don't think it's ever too late to right a wrong. The process of amending the covenants isn't just ceremonial in my opinion, because you're actually changing the contractual agreement amongst the subdivision owners. You're recording that. It's become a recorded enforceable instrument that now says everyone's welcome. So if you did that process, you've made real change. And I've said this before, our student group's still, looking to tackle this issue. It's been slowed down by COVID. If anyone in their subdivision neighborhood wants to tackle the issue, I'd be happy to draft the amendment, for you to accomplish that. It just takes some work.
and going door to door to get those signatures and educate your neighbors. But I do believe, it would be real helpful to tell people coming outside of Cheyenne. We know that we're a very welcoming community, but I think that we need to let other people know that as well. So, my opinion is it's not just ceremonial, that there's a real need for this.
Richard, anything to add to that?
I obviously thought it was an important enough issue to bring it up originally when I did my original post. And obviously Chris and I's friendship, has grown because of this topic, that we have, this is one of our conversation pieces whenever we see each other to find out where each other's at on it. So no, I feel it's still very important, and as far as worrying about if, there's other things to worry about, well, I'm multifaceted. I worry about lots of things. And so I, think this is something that's important, and definitely encourage, individuals to get in, touch with Chris or, through their law office or, or even me, if they're looking to volunteer, that this is something that they, want to get taken care of.
Richard, you referred to unwritten laws in terms of people of certain races maybe not living in certain parts of Cheyenne. Is that still part of our subconscious culture here today or not?
I believe it is. I mean, you can look at even in the last few months when Councilman Escabel and Roybal set up their meeting at the community house to discuss with individuals if they felt that they had been, mistreated by the police department, and they asked that the police not be present during that meeting so that people could feel they, weren't being looked over their shoulders. So, yeah. It is. I mean, and that one meeting, after the George Floyd killing just shows, that this is still an important issue, and it is still alive and well in Cheyenne.
Chris, anything to add to that?
Not really, Doug. I just want to, thank you for having us on to talk about this issue. The more education that we can get, hopefully we can, resolve these issues citywide, and we can tell the world that we're a very welcoming community, and everyone has equal opportunity here.
Now, if somebody out there is listening, and let's say, for example, they want to check the paperwork on their home, and they find out they have such a covenant in existence, and maybe they'd like to get rid of it, change it, what should they do?
First you got to get a copy of the covenant. Because I, have passion about this issue and righting a wrong, they can feel free to reach out to me. They can, I'm with a local law firm called Long Run Weinberger. They can look that up. I'd be happy to chat with them and tell them, how they could, go about it. I'm happy to draft any amendments for free. And there's not just myself, there's plenty of other people in Cheyenne that have passion for this issue as well that also can provide help. So I'm not trying to market myself. I just would love to see this issue resolved.
I was quite surprised. Is that a common reaction? Are people surprised when they learn about this if they didn't know already?
I believe the answer is yes.
You believe the answer is yes, Richard?
Yeah.
Were you surprised? You're a lifelong resident. Did it surprise you?
Yeah, it did.
Okay, we're just about out of time. And any last thoughts for our audience this morning on racial covenants? Anything that we haven't brought up that should be discussed, or anything else either of you would like to say on this issue?
Just what we've said, that reach out to me, reach out to Chris, and so we can get this going and maybe make some change.
Chris, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I'd echo what Richard says. I appreciate you giving us the time to chat about this. I appreciate Richard's enthusiasm for the issue and trying to resolve it. And frankly, it's very doable. And as we as a community could resolve this issue pretty easily, in my opinion.
Okay, I'd like to thank my guest on this segment. I've been speaking with Cheyenne attorney and University of Wyoming instructor Chris Koski and Cheyenne incoming again City Councilman Richard Johnson. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you, Doug.